The most famous Soviet tank of the Second World War, without a doubt, is the T-34. These combat machines became the real workhorses of the Red Army. They fought from the first to the last day of the war and became the most mass-produced tanks in history. Besides them, during the war, the Soviet Union produced heavy KV tanks, later replaced by tanks of the IS family, as well as light and small tanks. Many complaints are often made about the small tanks. There is even a widespread opinion they should have built tractors instead. The prospects of producing tractors and other special vehicles instead of these tanks are the subject of a separate article devoted to tank myths of 1941 to 1942. For now, let us talk about the real necessity of producing these machines and about what was happening at that time in tank building abroad. To begin with, it is worth remembering that at the start of the Second World War, the Red Army's armament system included 4 types of new tanks. These were small reconnaissance amphibious tanks, infantry support tanks, medium tanks, and heavy breakthrough tanks. At the same time, the small reconnaissance tank was viewed by the military with some doubt. The thing is that the vehicle accepted into service on December 19, 1939, in terms of its combat capabilities, was quite modest. Nor could this tank be called cheap. Initially, the price in the year 1941 was 81,000 rubles for a line tank and 86,000 for a tank with a radio. But in fact, the cost was 135,000 rubles. For comparison, the radio variant of the gun-armed armored car cost 56,000 rubles. At the beginning of 1941, the idea appeared to strengthen the armament of the small tank by installing a tank version of the 23mm aviation automatic cannon. But the brainchild of Taubin and Baburin turned out to be immature, so the trials did not take place. In addition, at the Molotov-Gorky automobile plant, they designed an armored car that, by its characteristics, did not yield to the small tank. The armor protection fully repeated the tank, the turret, and armament were taken from it as well, while the maximum speed was 50 miles per hour, which is almost twice that of the tank. The all-wheel drive chassis had the same engine as the tank, and the off-road capability of the armored car was at least no worse, and in fact hardly any worse or even slightly better. The main Armored Tank Directorate of the Red Army seriously considered adopting this armored vehicle. Moreover, this armored vehicle could replace several models of armored cars at once. Most likely, had the war not begun, the small amphibious tank would have met the same fate. The order for the year 1942 amounted to 800 machines, but that figure was from spring, before the trials of the new armored vehicle had been completed. A threat to the small tank also came from another side. On April 16, 1941, the Red Army adopted a new light tank, a long-awaited replacement for the old model. It was one of the best, if not the best, light tanks of that period. Quite quickly, the question arose of expanding production of this vehicle, and among the sites for rolling out production almost immediately appeared Plant Number 37. It must be said that in Leningrad they had long been sharpening their teeth against the small amphibious tank, calling it a colonial tank. Therefore, as soon as the war began, the question of producing the new light tank in Moscow arose instantly. At the same time, the management of Plant Number 37 did not object, and the decision to produce the new tank was supported. Only the Plant Design Bureau and the Military Acceptance Commission knew a bit more. First, the new tank had huge problems with its engines, the production of which had not been properly organized. Second, the machine tools, and more importantly, the lifting equipment of the plant required substantial modernization. One thing is to produce a 5-ton small tank, and quite another to produce a combat vehicle weighing 30,000 pounds. That is why Astrov and Okunev proposed producing a completely different tank. At first, the idea was to make a land version of the amphibious tank with armor increased to 0.8 inches. Later, a new tank appeared, a machine with a simplified hull and a new, easier-to-produce turret. In total, for the year 1941, it was planned to build 10,000 such tanks involving 3 factories. Plant Number 37, the Gorky automobile plant named after Molotov, and the Kharkiv tractor plant. The State Defense Committee supported the draft decree on manufacturing 10,000 light tanks for good reason. They fully understood that this new machine was a forced measure. The issue was that the Army urgently needed to replenish the losses of the first months of the war. It is enough to say that out of 9,987 light T-26 tanks available at the beginning of 1941, Only 2,742 remained a year later, just over one quarter. Most of them were stationed in the Transcaucasus and the Far East, while many of the T-26s still in service were located on the Leningrad front. The disastrous situation with the T-50 forced the plant to urgently resume production of the T-26. From parts prepared in July and August of 1941, 116 of these tanks were built, and they continued to fight until 1944. At the same time, the T-26 surpassed the T-40 and T-60 only in terms of armament and the presence of a larger two-man turret. In all other aspects, even vehicles with a conical turret and a conical turret base had little to boast about. Its armor protection was the same as that of the T-40, its speed was 1.5 times lower, and its cross-country ability in summer and autumn was worse. This was due to both higher ground pressure and lower engine power. In addition, the T-26's suspension required careful driving on soft terrain, otherwise there was a risk of the track slipping off. Finally, the T-26 was quite a tall tank. The difference in height between it and the T-40 was about 16 inches, and compared to the T-60, the difference exceeded 20 inches. The situation becomes even more interesting when we consider the accusations that the T-60 deprived the Red Army of tractors. In reality, this is not true. First, the State Defense Committee decree did not mean that tractors were forgotten. When the T-20 Komsomolets tractor was removed from production, another machine took its place, the GAZ 61416. This tractor was unarmored, but it proved to be much faster and, more importantly, capable of easily towing the new models of anti-tank artillery along with their ammunition. The Komsomolets, on the other hand, was unsuitable for towing the ZIS-2 gun. It could carry such a gun only if it was mounted directly on the tractor. That is how the ZIS-30 appeared. Second, GAZ was by no means the only manufacturer of the T-60. The main production site for this tank was the Kharkiv tractor plant, with a plan of 3,500 tanks for 1941. In second place was plant number 37, also with 3,500 tanks, and only in third place came GAZ, with 3,000 units. The Gorky automobile plant was given a softer schedule for introducing the tank into mass production. Third, the production of 10,000 T-60 units did not mean that work on the T-50 had stopped. The tank from the Leningrad plant still had major prospects, as everyone understood that this machine was the most promising light tank, including as a chassis for light self-propelled artillery. Neither the T-40 nor the T-60 were suitable as platforms for self-propelled guns because both had dimensions that were too small and engines that were not powerful enough. The main reason why the Soviet Army truck was never produced in large numbers lies not in a bad tank. The fate of this vehicle had already been sealed in the autumn of 1940, when the leadership of the People's Commissariat of the Aviation Industry took away from the Gorky automobile plant its engine workshop, which had been intended for motor production. This short-sighted decision had a serious impact not only on tank manufacturing but also on the entire automotive industry. A whole range of machines, including several truck and light tank models, was left without engines. It took more than half a year to somehow revive engine production. In fact, manufacturing began only during the war itself, and at first it concerned automobile engines rather than tank ones. It was precisely this half year that proved fatal for organizing the production of the next generation of military trucks. Enthusiasts of the tractor theory rarely realize that the typical artillery tractor in many armies was not a tracked vehicle, but a light, all-wheel drive army truck. This was the case in both the British and American armies. For the Americans, the standard anti-tank artillery tractor was the Dodge, comparable in its characteristics to the Soviet army truck. For the British, the typical vehicles of this class were rear-wheel drive and all-wheel drive trucks with a carrying capacity marked as 12 centners. Interestingly, that capacity also equaled roughly 3/4 of a ton, the same as the Dodge. In reality, the light tank consumed those very tractors at the Gorky automobile plant, named after Molotov in October 1941. That was a moment when anyone who dared to say, "Why build this tank? Let's make tractors instead," would have been shot on the spot. To understand the gravity of the situation, one must recall what was happening in October 1941. Even without describing the front, it becomes clear why this tank began to be produced at the Gorky automobile plant in such large quantities. One of the tank factories had not produced a single tank since August 1941. The plant was evacuated, and at the new location, workers were desperately trying to start any kind of production. By December 1941, they managed to deliver only 10 vehicles. The Kharkiv tractor plant was evacuated as well, with part of its equipment sent to the Stalingrad factory. The Moscow plant did not produce a single new tank. It continued building older models. In October 1941, this plant was sent into evacuation to Sverdlovsk. The Kolomna machine-building plant, which supplied armor hulls for the older tank models, was evacuated to Kirov. The situation with the production of the main medium tank was critical. The plant had been evacuated, managing to deliver 41 tanks in October. Another factory delivered 20 vehicles, and the Stalingrad tractor plant produced 124. In total, 185 tanks of this type were completed in October. Under the conditions of the German offensive, any tank was worth its weight in gold. Units from the Far East began moving toward Moscow, equipped with old light tanks and high-speed vehicles. It was at this very moment that Stalin's order came, something along the lines of "drop everything, the army needs tanks." In Gorky, this order was carried out to the letter. The production of trucks and passenger cars practically ceased to exist. But in October 1941, the most mass-produced tank on Soviet assembly lines became the new light tank. The situation becomes even more interesting when one considers that the small, older model tank produced by the Moscow factory was roughly equal in performance to the new one. If we add its production numbers, formally the old tanks began to be delivered from September 1941. The overall picture of tank output looks as follows. If we exclude 3 chassis of one type and 137 chassis of another that went into the production of rocket artillery launchers, the total comes to 1,650 light tanks. During the same period, 1,163 medium tanks were built, and only in September did their production surpass that of the light tanks. The peak of light tank production came at the beginning of 1942. In January, 876 tanks were delivered, in February, 815, and in March, 725. Only in April of 1942 did the medium tanks finally overtake the light ones in production, largely because 2 factories had begun preparing for the manufacture of a more advanced model. The continued high output, around 650 vehicles in May and June 1942, was maintained by factories that, for technical reasons, could produce only light tanks. These were 2 factories. One of them, in July 1942, first switched to a new model and was then quickly retooled for medium tank production, and later for self-propelled artillery vehicles. As for the second plant, in July 1942, it stopped producing tanks altogether, focusing entirely on manufacturing hulls for medium tanks. In short, light tank production continued only because at that moment there was simply no viable alternative. Once a suitable replacement appeared, the model was taken off the assembly line. From the standpoint of both the military command and industry, this was a perfectly reasonable decision. Unlike medium and heavy tanks, Soviet light tanks have received little attention. They are often criticized for their weak and defective automatic gun, poor armor protection, limited mobility in snow, and other shortcomings. That is, in fact, one of the main arguments of their detractors. Why build a tank if it can do nothing? Such opinions are usually backed by comparative figures, which, more often than not, are far from reality. This view is one-sided and contradicted by the numbers. For instance, by loss statistics. According to the consolidated report of the Armored and Mechanized Forces Headquarters for 1944, as of January 1, 1942, there were 710 light tanks in service. This figure partly excludes those produced in December 1941, but includes earlier models that were also recorded as later types, meaning a bit less than half of all light tanks built in 1941. If we assume that amphibious tanks were also counted here, which is most likely the case, and that the number does include all completed vehicles, then 710 of 2014 remained. In other words, in the inferno of the 1941 battles, 1/3 of those little ones survive. Now let us look at the situation with medium tanks. By June 1, 1941, there were 1,129 units, and another 1,886 were produced between July and December of that year. In total, 3,115 tanks, though the figure is slightly approximate since it does not fully include the June 1941 output. Of these, as of January 1, 1942, only 651 remained, roughly one-fifth of all medium tanks. The survival statistics for heavy tanks are also worth mentioning. By July 1, 1941, 636 heavy tanks had been delivered, with another 930 completed in the latter half of the year. Altogether, 1,566 heavy tanks were built, of which by January 1, 1942, 403 remained, a bit more than one quarter. One cannot help but wonder which tank then truly deserved to be called a doomed one. "Wait a moment," exclaimed the witnesses of the armored personnel carriers. "That's not fair. Let's also count 1942, then everything will make sense." Let's count. Over the entire period, about 5,500 light tanks were produced, not including chassis for multiple rocket launch systems. Removing the vehicles produced in 1941 and adding the tanks that were available at the beginning of 1942, we get 4,560 light tanks. The same report from the Organizational Department of the Headquarters of Armored and Mechanized Forces of the Red Army for 1944 tells us that at the beginning of 1943, 1,977 light tanks remained, meaning roughly 43% of the little ones survived. Now let's look at the medium tanks. In 1942, 12,534 tanks were produced. Adding 651 machines that survived the battles of 1941, we get 13,185 in total. By the beginning of 1943, 6,465 of them remained, slightly less than half, so the difference in survival statistics was not significant. Next, let's examine the heavy tanks. In 1942, 1,802 regular heavy tanks and flamethrower variants were built, plus 624 lighter versions. Together with those that survived 1941, this gives 2,829 units. At the beginning of 1943, there were 1,376 heavy tanks of all types, about 48%. It is also interesting to look at another light tank. In 1942, 4,883 were produced, and at the beginning of 1943, 3,042 remained, more than 60%. What a surprise! According to statistics, light tank crews actually had the best chances of survival, the so-called mass grave for six. The American medium tank also views all this with some surprise. In 1942, 812 such tanks were delivered to the Soviet Union. By the beginning of 1943, 502 remained, again more than 60%, even though 1942 was the period of their most intense use. Other foreign machines are also worth mentioning. Between 1941 and 1942, 771 British infantry tanks entered service with the Red Army, and by the beginning of 1943, 375 remained, a little less than half. Another British tank type had a higher survival rate. Out of 1,175 supplied in 1941 to 1942, 672 remained by early 1943, about 57%. Both British types, however, had already suffered losses back in 1941, so their actual 1942 losses were smaller. Of course, these numbers are somewhat stretched, but no more than the figures and facts that armchair experts love to throw around. Moreover, the very high losses among medium and heavy tanks had solid reasons: poor visibility, mechanical reliability issues, especially among heavy tanks, and often irrational tactical use. We should not forget that tanks were meant primarily to support infantry formations, and fighting alone often ended tragically. Of course, the combat effectiveness of medium and heavy tanks was higher than that of the little ones. Nevertheless, the results of light tank operations were often at least no worse than those of their sturdier counterparts. While production of a new light tank type was unfolding, its predecessor entered battle in large numbers. One of the first units to receive these vehicles was the 1st Tank Brigade, later the 6th Guards Tank Brigade. Essentially, these were still the earlier light tanks, often without amphibious equipment. In total, the brigade received 32 tanks of this type. Their debut came in the battle near Lipivka. There, acting together with heavy and medium tanks, the light tanks launched a massive counterattack. Losing 4 light tanks burned out, the 1st Tank Battalion destroyed 13 anti-tank guns, 4 howitzers, 7 mortars, 16 motorcycles, and 2 fuel trucks. In turn, the medium tanks claimed 6 enemy tanks destroyed. The unfortunate victim of this engagement was the German 4th Panzer Division. The next day, during the battles for Semenivka, they lost another 4 T-30 tanks. However, they managed to destroy 7 enemy anti-tank guns and 7 mortars. After that, the brigade's light tanks continued to be used together with T-34s, which served as reinforcement. Many times in defensive fights, the T-30s took part in smashing German columns. In short, they acted clearly within the limits of their capabilities. Their main targets were enemy infantry, anti-tank artillery, and trucks. The first T-60 tanks produced at the Gorky automobile plant were used in combat by the 21st Tank Brigade. It is known as the only unit that received T-34s equipped with special anti-tank guns. Only the combat use proved, frankly, to be questionable. During the raid on Kalinin, now the city of Tver, on the 17th of October, 1941, the brigade had in its composition 28 T-34s, 3 BT light tanks, and 8 T-60s. There were no German tanks in those areas at all, only self-propelled assault guns from the 660th Battery. But the result of the raid on Kalinin was 16 T-34s destroyed. The Germans suffered significant losses. On the approach to Kalinin, the brigade's tanks routed several transport columns and then struck the German airfield. Still, the exchange proved unequal. By the 20th, only 2 T-34s, 4 BTs, and 2 T-60s remained serviceable. Most of the tanks needed repair, and gradually some of the vehicles were returned to service. As a result of the brigade's 6 tanks by the end of October, 4 were T-60s. A detailed study of the combat employment of the T-30 and the T-60 in the years 1941 to 1942 shows the same picture. Lack of coordination between tank and rifle units, frequent cases when tanks had to fight without infantry support, which caused them heavy losses. In such a situation, it seems odd to blame an unsuitable tank. Of course, having a sturdier vehicle like the T-50 would have been better, but it is enough to recall how that tank performed to understand, in the conditions of the first year of the war, the quality of the combat vehicle often had little effect on the outcome. The best light tank of the early war very quickly wore out in the units to which it was sent. Neither in the 150th Tank Brigade, nor in the 1st Tank Division, nor in other units did these machines particularly distinguish themselves. As a result, the situation arose where what mattered was not so much the quality of the tanks as their number. The latter point was more than satisfied by the T-60, a mass-produced light tank that cost only slightly more than an armored car with a gun. Moreover, the infantry often did not care what gun a tank had or what size it was. The mere presence of a tank, even one like the T-60, had a positive moral effect. Overall, the small tanks proved to be quite decent, especially considering their initially not very impressive characteristics. It would be strange to expect a former reconnaissance tank to have the same performance as a full-fledged light tank. At the same time, to say that such machines were completely unsuitable for infantry support is not entirely fair. Even the first version with a large-caliber machine gun posed a serious threat to enemy infantry. The next model received a 20mm automatic cannon, a more powerful weapon that appeared largely by accident. It turned out that to produce 10,000 tanks, there would simply not be enough machine guns, so an alternative was urgently found in the form of an aircraft automatic cannon. In terms of armor penetration, the difference was small, but that cannon fired a high explosive fragmentation shell. Of course, its effectiveness was low, but nonetheless, it was better than a simple bullet. Often, one can hear claims about the unreliability of this gun, but the matter is more nuanced. In most cases, the issue lay not in the gun itself, but in how it was handled. Problems also arose with the connecting links, whose design was often altered arbitrarily by the manufacturing plants. The situation escalated to the point that Spitalny, one of the gun's developers, filed a formal complaint to higher authorities. There were also numerous recorded cases of barrel swelling caused by poor quality shell fuses. Therefore, before labeling this gun as defective, one should first examine the official documentation of the relevant departments instead of drawing hasty conclusions. Moreover, the Army units also reported positive feedback on the gun's performance and its overall effectiveness. When this tank was accepted into service, the Soviet Armored Command understood exactly what kind of vehicle they were getting. There were no illusions about its armament. As early as the summer of 1941, the question of increasing the tank's firepower was raised. In the autumn, experimental work began on installing a 45mm tank gun in the turret. These experiments eventually led to the creation of a new vehicle. By the end of 1941, production had started on tanks first equipped with additional armor and later with reinforced protection. As a result, the vehicle's resistance to enemy anti-tank fire improved. Of course, the reinforced armor could not protect it from 50 or 75mm guns, but the range of infantry weapons capable of damaging the tank was significantly reduced. Even by early 1944, these tanks remained quite common on the battlefield. Out of 1,638 tanks listed as of January 1, 1944, 684 were still serving in frontline units. Their last large-scale combat use occurred during the battles on the Leningrad front in the summer and autumn of 1944. Not bad for a temporary tank designed in just 10 days. No one disputes that these tanks were a forced measure. They appeared during the hardest period of the war and left the assembly lines when a proper replacement finally became available. Yet it is worth remembering not only these machines, but also other tanks with similar characteristics. In fact, many of these analogs fought on the Soviet-German front, but on the opposite side. Unlike the Soviet light tanks, these vehicles were not emergency designs, but purpose-built from the start. First, it is necessary to clarify what the T-60 truly represented among combat vehicles. It is often called a light tank, but that is not entirely correct. In reality, the T-60, like its predecessor, the T-40, belonged to the category of small tanks. These were combat vehicles weighing between 6,600 and 11,000 pounds, featuring bullet-resistant armor, a crew of 2 or 3 men, and machine gun armament. They often mounted heavy machine guns and, less commonly, small-caliber cannons. Typical representatives of this class included the 8,800-pound export Vickers tanks and the British light tank Mark VI, the most numerous British tank at the start of the Second World War. The German light tank family also belonged to this category, and with some flexibility, the Italian Carro Armato L6 could also be considered a small tank. The Italian machine was a direct development of the Carro Armato L3 line. Its combat weight slightly exceeded the classification limits, but overall it still fit the small tank category. The amusing detail was that initially this vehicle was called a medium tank. On the Soviet-German front, Italian small tanks appeared in the summer of 1942, and they were the only tank type used by the Italians in the Soviet Union. Although the Carro Armato L6 initially had thicker armor than the T-60, by the summer of 1942 both tanks were roughly equal. The machines were similar in many aspects, but the Italian tank's boxy shape, as well as its riveted hull and turret, were clear disadvantages. Its visibility was also poor, and it was significantly taller than its Soviet counterpart. Interestingly, production of the Carro Armato L6 continued until 1944, with the final vehicles of this type built for the Germans. Some viewers might ask whether it is fair to point to the Italians, who clearly lagged in tank building. In that case, let us look at another country that produced small tanks, Germany. They had their own undersized, overgrown light tank, and it was designed as a small vehicle from the start. I am talking about the German tank better known as PZKPF-WW-E-AUSFC. This tank was meant to be a direct development of the previous line, yet it was built from scratch. As a result of development, instead of an 11,000-pound machine, there emerged a 17,600-pound combat vehicle with 1.2 inches of armor and very high-speed characteristics. The armament, however, consisted of a tank version of an anti-tank rifle paired with a machine gun. Even against Soviet weapons and the 20mm Breda automatic cannon mounted on the Carro Armato L6, such a main caliber looked unserious. That did not stop the Germans from making plans not only to produce 40 vehicles for a 0 series, but even to contemplate 1,000 tanks for a large series. Even when it became clear that such machines were no longer needed, nobody canceled the order for the 0 series. The first series production tanks were ready at the end of 1942, and production finished entirely in 1943. The result of attempting to use this vehicle on the Soviet-German front was predictable. By the end of October 1943, the PFW or AUSFC was little more than a fast target. So after sending off 2 tanks, the other vehicles were shipped to France, away from the danger zone. The Germans were not the only ones to mount anti-tank rifles as the main armament on their tanks. The 20mm Solothurn anti-tank rifle was the primary weapon of the Hungarian light tank Toldi in its first version. That vehicle was a licensed copy of a Swedish light tank. It was a true light tank, but in combat capability it hardly outclassed the Soviet T-60. Its armor in general was inferior to the Soviet machine. The Hungarians had no illusions about the Toldi's combat potential. Already in 1941, an improved version appeared. The Toldi second version, with a 40mm gun and armor increased to 0.8 inches. Still, this machine looked weak, which is why in 1942, fewer than 24 of these Toldi tanks were used. The core of the tank units of the 1st Tank Division consisted of Czech tanks received from the Germans, and there were also German medium tanks of the 4th model. Finally, the enemy had a tank that fought in large numbers and did not greatly outperform the T-60. I am, of course, speaking about the German 2nd model light tank. It is worth noting that comparing it with the T-60 is not entirely correct. The point is that this German vehicle is the German vision of a light infantry support tank. Its direct counterparts were the British Vickers, as well as the Soviet T-26 and the Czech tanks. In the campaigns of 1939 and 1940, this German vehicle was the most common German tank. On the Soviet-German front, these machines were used very widely, although in a smaller percentage since by then there were already enough tanks with more powerful armament. Nevertheless, of the 1,024 of these German tanks that were in the German army on June 1, 1941, 424 were irrecoverably lost on the Soviet-German front in the year 1941. That alone speaks volumes about the intensity of their combat use. And the first models of German tanks were not idle either. There were 877 of those machines in total, of which 428 were lost on the Soviet-German front during the year 1941. Moreover, tanks that were originally built as training vehicles were even converted into combat machines. Such conversions are on display at the Patriot Park. Apparently, the German command did not know that it would be better to make tractors out of these tanks. As for the 2nd model of German light tanks, it was not only used but also produced. From March 1941 to July 1942, German factories delivered 509 such tanks of the F modification. On the battlefield, this vehicle was not much superior to the T-60. The capabilities of its 20mm gun were comparable to the Soviet TNS. Yes, there was an armor-piercing sub-caliber shell, but they were issued in small quantities. Nevertheless, the Germans continued production until the summer of 1942, when it became clear that such machines had exhausted their usefulness. It must be said that the production of this modification was partly a forced measure. The point is that it was launched into series because another far more ambitious program had stalled, the program for new generation tanks. To understand the scale of this mega project, it is enough to recall the size of the planned order. According to the plans dated May 30th, 1941, between 1941 and 1945, they intended to receive nearly 14,000 tanks of this type. One of the models was supposed to be a combat vehicle weighing about 22,000 pounds, with frontal armor 1.2 inches thick, a single-seat turret, as with other German light tanks, and a 20mm automatic gun. Similar to the high-speed version of the first model of the German tank, this vehicle was expected to reach a high speed, about 40 miles per hour. It never went beyond paper, but its closest relative became the G version of the 2nd model of the German light tank. This vehicle entered production in 1942 with a total of 45 units delivered. The plan to build nearly 14,000 aggressor tanks was never realized. Nevertheless, the scale of the idea itself shows that, in mid-1941, the Germans did not consider the 2nd model of the light tank obsolete. It is also worth noting that the Germans did not consider the 20mm automatic gun weak armament. The last German light tank equipped with such a weapon was built as late as 1944. It was a reconnaissance tank. The German command believed that for reconnaissance purposes, a 20mm automatic gun was entirely sufficient. And it must be said they were not entirely wrong. If we look at reconnaissance tanks and armored vehicles that appeared after the war, we can see many combat machines armed with a heavy machine gun or an automatic cannon of calibers ranging from 20 to 30 millimeters. History sometimes moves in a spiral. In the early 1930s, short-barreled 37-millimeter guns were replaced by heavy machine guns or small-caliber automatic cannons. Later, designers and the military returned to cannons once again. And after the war, the cycle began anew.